Welcome back, guys. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you're doing well and staying safe. Today's story comes from a man named Walter Hensley. He lived in a small logging town in southern Oregon back in 1908. Let's get started. The Winter Visitor. My grandfather's Bigfoot secret. Some stories don't need to be believed. They just need to be told. He never meant to tell anyone. For nearly 50 years, he kept that winter to himself, buried somewhere between the frost-bitten pines of southern Oregon and the aching silence of his own memory. But one night, not long before he passed, my grandfather whispered the story to me like it was a prayer. Something fragile, almost sacred. In 1908, deep in the Cascades, Walter Hensley lived alone in a cabin he built with a broken leg and a worn-out axe. He was a man of silence, not sentiment. A man who once said, "If the forest doesn't take you, the loneliness will." And yet, something found him. It came not with a growl, but with a whimper. Not charging through the trees, but standing quietly in the fog, hungry and watching. It wasn't human, but it wasn't just animal either. What happened that winter would change the way he saw the world and how he saw himself. This isn't a story about monsters. It's a story about mercy. About what happens when two lost things find each other. And about a promise kept through snow, silence, and time. He called it The Visitor. And this is what he told me. He always said the forest had its own kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but a waiting stillness. Like it was listening, judging. Walter Hensley never feared the wild. He feared the people who'd forgotten how to respect it. That September morning in 1908, the sky was colorless. Not quite gray, just empty. He was returning from checking his traps near the creek, a path he'd walked hundreds of times since he'd settled into his cabin high in the Cascade Range. He walked with a limp, still favoring the leg that had been mangled in a rail yard accident back east. But that day, something pulled his eyes from the trail. Tracks. They were set deep into the mud along the creek's edge, weeder than a man's boot, the toes spread out like fingers. 6, maybe 7 inches long, too large for a child. Too precise for a bear. No claw marks, no drag. Just clean, round impressions that led to the water and stopped, as if whatever left them had stepped into the stream and vanished. Walter crouched low, touched the edge of one with his fingertips. The soil was cool, freshly disturbed, still damp in the center. Whatever had been here, it wasn't long gone. He looked up, slowly. Nothing. The trees stood still, pretending not to notice him. That night, the sound came again. He'd heard it once or twice in the past few weeks. Distant, muffled, easy to blame on foxes or wind slipping through trees. But this time, it was closer. Not a howl, not a scream. A cry. Thin. Reedy. Childlike. It rose and fell like someone trying to hold it in. Then silence. Then again, he stepped out onto his porch, lantern in hand, listening. The clearing around his cabin was still. Chickens rustled in their coop, uneasy. Walter called out, more from instinct than hope. Hello? Nothing. Just that lingering cry, floating in from the dark line where forest met clearing. Sad, soaked in something, broken. The next morning he found nothing. No prints. No rustling. Just the quiet shame of having imagined too much. But that night, the crying returned, and the next, and the next. By the 4th night, he couldn't take it anymore, so he left a biscuit. Just one, crumbled on the flat stump by the woodshed. An offering, or maybe a test. Something in him. A man used to rabbits and snares and raccoons in the root cellar. Wanted to understand what was out there. Who was out there? When he woke at dawn, the biscuit was gone. Not scattered or torn, not chewed. go, as if someone had gently picked it up and carried it away. The cries didn't stop, but they didn't get louder either, like whatever made them was waiting for something. Walter began to leave more. A strip of dried venison, half a slice of bread, a ladle of stew once cooled. Each morning, the food vanished. Not a crumb, not a drop. For a man who had carved out his solitude with pain and firewood, Walter Hensley was beginning to feel watched. And then it happened. A fog had crawled in from the trees that morning, thick and low, hugging the ground like smoke. Walter was splitting wood, the echo of each strike bouncing off the trunks behind him. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow when the hairs on his neck rose, not from chill, but from instinct. He turned slowly. At the far edge of the clearing, where the trees began to swallow the light, something stood, small, covered in matted dark fur, no taller than his chest. Its arms hung slightly forward, its body hunched not from menace, but hunger. Trembling, its eyes met his, and didn't look away. Walter didn't move. He didn't breathe, and neither did it, until he did something he hadn't planned. He set the hatchet down, reached into the pocket of his coat, and pulled out a piece of rabbit he'd roasted the night before. He walked halfway to the stump, slow and careful, like approaching a deer too smart for snares. He laid the meat down and stepped back. 2, 3 paces. No words, just waiting. The creature stepped out, quiet, deliberate, each movement cautious but sure. It approached the stump, sniffed once, then picked up the food with small, nearly human hands. And then it disappeared into the trees. For the rest of the day, Walter didn't move far from the clearing. He wasn't afraid. Not exactly, but something had changed. The forest was no longer just watching. It had reached out. That night, for the first time in weeks, the crying stopped. It was replaced by silence. Not peace, but something else entirely. And he knew, without a doubt, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. You don't know how far kindness can go, he'd tell me, decades later, until you offer it to something that isn't supposed to exist. But Walter was wrong about one thing, because after that winter, it never really left. There's a certain kind of quiet that sets in after you've heard something unnatural. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that waits. Walter Hensley had lived long enough in the woods to know the language of wind, branches, owls, wolves. But whatever made that cry, it didn't belong to any of them. It was something else, something small, alone, in pain. By the 5th night, Walter's sleep had turned shallow. He lay in his cot, fully clothed, boots beside him, rifle resting at arm's reach, not because he feared what might come, but because he feared it might not. The crying didn't stop. It came at different hours now. Sometimes before the moon climbed, sometimes after, but always from the same place, just past the edge of his clearing, where the trees thickened into shadow. He began to track it against his better judgment. The following afternoon, he moved slow along the creek, stepping lightly in case whatever was out there had left a trace. The stump where he left food had become a ritual. First a biscuit, then scraps of jerky, then a full ladle of rabbit stew, still warm. Always gone by morning, and always without a trace. But that day, something changed. Beneath the briars near the bend in the trail, Walter spotted them. Prints. Faint, but unmistakable. Not like the ones from before. These were smaller, uneven, as though the creature had limped or dragged a foot. He followed them deeper into the trees, his breath sharp in the early autumn air. And then he heard it. Not the cry, but breathing, ragged, panicked. He stopped, held his breath, turned slowly, and saw it, crouched low in a patch of ferns, partially hidden by a tangle of brush. The creature was staring at him, eyes too large for its face, reflecting the daylight like dark glass. Its frame looked frail now, ribs pressing against the fur, arms tucked close to its chest like a child trying to stay warm. Walter didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, He did the one thing that felt right. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a piece of dried meat, and held it out. No sudden movements. Just his hand, open, waiting. The creature didn't run. It didn't growl or flinch. It just blinked. Once, twice. Then, with surprising grace, it stepped forward, closed the space between them, and took the food. Fingers curling like small hands. Rough, cold, real. It ate in silence, watching him with unblinking eyes. And in that moment, Walter saw something he hadn't expected. Fear. Not of him, but of everything else. Like this thing, whatever it was, had known suffering, rejection, abandonment. Like it had lost something. Or someone. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He kept the fire going, listening to every crack and pop in the stove like it might answer questions he didn't dare ask. The wind moaned low across the roof. The trees outside didn't move, but the crying was gone. Not replaced by peace, just absence. For 3 days, nothing came. No footprints, no food taken, no sound at night. Walter felt it like a weight behind his ribs. Regret, maybe. Or fear that he'd done something wrong, that he'd broken whatever fragile trust had begun to form. On the 4th night, the sound returned. But not from the woods, from the clearing. Soft, labored. Walter stepped onto the porch with his lantern held high. The light caught the edge of something near the woodshed, a shape slumped against the wall. He approached slowly, heart pounding louder than his boots on the earth. It was the creature, collapsed. Shivering, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Its limbs were thinner than before, its chest rising and falling with uneven gasps. It had come to him, not for food, for shelter. He didn't hesitate. He knelt beside it, slid his arms under the small, trembling frame, and lifted it, lighter than he expected. Bone and fur, that was all. He carried it inside, wrapped it in a blanket, and laid it near the fire. He offered water first, then broth. It drank slowly, like every movement cost something. Walter sat across from it, watching, waiting. And then it looked at him, not with fear, not with gratitude, with recognition. He didn't know what it was, not really. But in that moment he knew what it wasn't. It wasn't a monster. It was a child. But here's the thing that kept Walter awake long after the fire dimmed. It hadn't come alone. Somewhere out there, something else had let it go, or left it, or worse, lost it. And whatever that was, Walter prayed he'd never see it. But prayers out here don't always stick. It was the fog that made it stranger. That morning haze so thick you could barely see the tops of your boots, let alone what might be standing a few yards into the trees. Walter had woken early, like always. He wasn't expecting anything. Truth be told, he'd almost convinced himself the thing from nights before was gone for good. Maybe it had moved on. Maybe it hadn't survived. But the stew pot was empty again. Clean. Like always, he stepped out with his axe. Not to work. Not yet. Just to stand. The ground was soft beneath him, the air damp and cold on his cheeks. The forest line was a blur, melted into the fog. Then he felt it. That trickling again. That awful stillness. He turned toward the edge of the clearing, and there it was. Small, maybe 4 feet tall, standing half-shadowed behind a cedar. The fog drifted around it like water, its dark fur slick with dew. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, watching him. Walter didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for the rifle propped by the door. Instead, he bent down and picked up a strip of jerky from the porch rail, the kind had left out the night before, and walked slowly to the old stump near the woodshed. He placed it down, then he stepped back. The creature came forward, and in those few steps, everything Walter thought he understood unraveled. Its movement was cautious, but not clumsy. It didn't waddle like a bear cub, didn't scamper like a raccoon. It walked, almost upright, knees bent, arms low but swinging slightly, like it was built to move this way, like it was born in the hush between nightfall and daybreak. It reached the stump, sniffed once, and took the food. Fingers, not paw, thick, stubby, but with enough articulation to grasp, to feel. Walter exhaled. Maybe for the first time in minutes. The creature looked up at him. Those eyes again, wide, black as ink, but not empty. They held something, not understanding, not exactly, but awareness. Curiosity, maybe even trust. And then, as quick as it had come, it turned and disappeared into the fog. Walter didn't go back inside. Not right away. He sat on the porch, axe laid across his knees, and watched the tree line until the sun began to burn through the mist. But even then, even in the light, he wasn't sure he'd really seen what he thought he saw. For the next few days it returned, always early, always alone. He'd leave food, berries, leftover bread, salted fish. The creature never came too close, never crossed the boundary between the trees and the cabin. But it always came, and it had always looked at him before it vanished again, like it was waiting for something more. Then one morning, Walter did something different. He didn't leave food. He didn't even wait at the porch. He followed the tracks. They were fresh. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth along the east trail. He moved quiet, slower than usual, every step measured. His leg ached from the cold, but he ignored it. Half a mile in, the trees opened into a small glade, one he hadn't seen before, and there, near a fallen log, it sat. The creature looked worse than it had in days past. Thinner, shoulders hunched, breathing shallow. It didn't startle at his approach, didn't retreat, just stared. Walter sat across from it, leaving a few feet between them. He took the jerky from his coat and held it out. No words. Just his hand. The creature hesitated, then crawled forward, slower this time, and took it gently. Its fingers brushed his palm, coarse, cool, but careful. It stayed this time, gnawing slowly, watching him with that same unreadable gaze. He noticed a nick on its arm, red, raw, like it had scraped itself on something running through the woods. Without thinking, Walter pulled a scrap of cloth from his pocket, clean linen from an old shirt, and offered it. The creature didn't move, so he set it down between them. A peace offering, maybe something more. It didn't take the cloth, not yet, but it stayed, and that was enough. For the next few evenings, Walter visited the clearing. He brought food, water, sat in silence, talked sometimes, quietly, about nothing in particular. Stories from his railroad days, his childhood in Kansas, the time lightning struck the barn and split the roof clean in half. The creature listened, not like a dog hears a sound, but like a person absorbs a memory. And then came the night that changed everything. Walter had just finished supper. The sky was a dark wash of stars above the trees. He was closing up the coop when he heard it, not from the woods but from the side of the cabin. A shuffle, a scrape. He turned and saw it, there, just past the corner, half in the light of the lantern had left hanging on the hook. It had come closer, closer than ever. Its eyes glinted orange in the firelight. Its chest rose and fell slow, and for the first time it stepped fully into the clearing. Walter froze. His breath caught in his throat. The creature looked around, took a cautious step forward, and sat down beside the fire ring. Not in it, just near it. Like it wanted to feel the warmth. It didn't look afraid. And Walter, he didn't feel fear either. He sat across from it, the flames between them, and the world shrank down to the crackle of pine wood and the low hiss of boiling water. The creature reached toward the heat with both hands, not close enough to burn, just enough to feel. It looked human. That thought struck Walter harder than he expected. It looked human. Hooked shoulders, knees folded close, eyes blinking against the light. It wasn't a beast. Not anymore. "I don't know what you are," Walter whispered, voice dry with awe. "But you ain't alone anymore." The creature looked up at him and nodded. Just once. That's when he knew. Whatever this thing was, it trusted him. But he also knew this. Something that trusts you can be taken from you. And out here, in the deep woods, nothing is truly safe. Not even kindness. Especially not kindness. Because the moment Walter let it in was the moment something else began watching from just beyond the firelight. Something taller, heavier, and far less curious. For the first time in weeks, Walter didn't wake to the sound of that cry. Instead, he rose with the hush of dawn. The cabin cold, the fire nearly gone to ash. There was a stillness in the air that didn't feel natural. Not peace, but expectation. As if something in the trees was waiting for his next move, and so he made one. He didn't bring the axe that morning, nor his rifle. Just a satchel with bread, jerky, a small canteen of water, and the old cloth he'd offered days ago. He walked past the stump, past the old snares he never used anymore, and followed the faint trail of pressed leaves leading deeper into the woods, paths he hadn't touched since autumn's first frost. Roughly a mile out, he reached the glade again, the same patch of soft earth, tucked between leaning cedars and mossy stones. And there it was, curled under a low-hanging branch, barely a shadow in the early light. It looked thinner, its fur-dull shoulders hunched in a way that pulled Walter's heart lower in his chest. He crouched slowly and placed the food nearby, but didn't move to leave. This time he sat down. Minutes passed before the creature shifted. It didn't look up. It just sniffed, turned its head and reached toward the offering. Not with hunger, not with fear, but with something like resignation. Walter spoke softly, the way one might talk to a wounded dog. Not words to be understood, just tones to say, "I'm not here to harm you." "I brought you water," he murmured, nudging the canteen closer. "And I figured maybe you could use something warm." The creature took the food with slow movements, chewing in silence. Its eyes, when they met his, were less wide now. Less black and unreadable. More tired. For the next hour, they sat like that. A man and something else, breathing the same air in a clearing the world had long forgotten. And then it did something Walter didn't expect. It slid forward on its knees, reached for the canteen, and drank. Not like an animal. No lapping. No spilling. It held the tin with both hands, tilted it, drank, and then set it down with care. Walter watched, pulse in his throat. Not because of fear. "Because of awe you were learning," he whispered. The creature tilted its head at the sound. That afternoon, Walter returned with a wool blanket, and it let him place it on its shoulders. He began coming back every morning, always with food. Sometimes with tools, sometimes with tools. A small tin cup, a second blanket, a wooden spoon. The creature used them, not immediately, not fluidly, but with curiosity, with trial and error. It watched how Walter used things, mimicked him, and it stayed. It never followed him home, not yet, but every day it waited at the glade, its body slowly filling out, movements stronger. He noticed a softness to its mouth, lips, not snout, nails, not claw, and the way it listened, like it was absorbing his voice, not just the sounds, but the rhythm of words. One morning, As Walter approached, it stood upright. Not fully straight, not with confidence, but enough that it towered over him by a head, 4 foot something, maybe more. Broad-shouldered now. Its hair had grown thick, fuller across the back and arms, darker around the eyes. And then, for the first time, it reached for him. Not to take food, but to touch. A hand, rough and warm, rested on his forearm, not gripping, just resting. A connection. Walter didn't speak. He couldn't. Because in that moment he felt it like a jolt under his skin. This thing had been alone for a long, long time. And maybe so had he. That night he left the cabin door unlatched. Not open, just not locked. He didn't know why. Maybe a gesture. Maybe a welcome. Maybe a warning to whatever else might be watching. The following evening, as he stirred rabbit stew over the fire, something shifted outside. A weight on the porch, a shadow behind the curtain. He opened the door, and there it was. Standing still, silent, just outside the light. He stepped aside. No words. The creature stepped forward. 1 foot inside the cabin, then the other. It didn't explore, didn't touch. Just stood in the corner near the fire and lowered itself to the floor. Walter gave it the stew. It took the bowl in its hands, awkwardly at first, then with steadiness. It didn't slurp. It ate. And for hours neither of them spoke, because nothing needed saying. Later that night he laid a bed of pine boughs beside the hearth, placed another blanket on top, and motioned gently. The creature curled into it, back to the flames, breath slowing. And then it happened. As the fire dimmed and Walter prepared to sleep, a sound sliced the stillness outside. Low, guttural, too deep for a man, too coarse for a wolf. The creature sat up instantly. So did Walter. He stepped to the window, peered into the dark. Something moved beyond the tree line. A flicker of shape. Large. Watching. He reached for his rifle. But the creature growled, a low, warning growl. And then it stood, taller now, posture straight, back arched. It walked to the door and opened it with one hand. Walter called out, "Don't!" But it didn't turn. It just stepped into the night. What followed was silence, longer than any had known since the crying first began. Then, from far off, 2 distinct howls. One higher, one lower, then nothing. Until the creak of the door again, it returned. No wounds, no blood, just calm. It closed the door behind it, sat by the fire, and nodded once. Walter didn't ask. He didn't need to. Because whatever it had faced out there, it had done so for him. And he knew from that night forward, this wasn't just something he was helping survive. This was something that had chosen to protect him in return. But the part he never told anyone, not even me, until the very end. There was more than one howl. The wind carried snow before it ever touched the ground. Not in flakes. No, this was the kind that scraped sideways across the forest, dry and bitter. A warning in every gust. Walter knew what that meant. Winter wasn't coming. It was already here. He chopped wood longer that day, stacking it high along the north wall. Chickens had stopped laying. The creek had begun to crust over at the edges. The forest, once full of soft footfalls and rustling branches, now stood silent and sharp. That evening, as twilight pressed in, the creature didn't come to the door. Walter waited until the fire had gone from orange to blue. Still nothing. Not a single noise. He paced the cabin, boots heavy on the floorboards, peering through frostbitten windows into a blackness that looked back. He put on his coat. The snow had already risen ankle-deep by the time he reached the edge of the clearing. His lantern light caught the faintest trail of uneven prints, dragging slightly. Not fresh, but not yet buried. They led to the woodshed, then beyond. Walter followed. Behind the second row of trees, tucked into the low shadow of an outcrop stone, it lay curled tight, fur stiff with ice, arms wrapped around its knees, breath shallow. It was shivering, and for the first time, it didn't lift its head when he approached. He dropped beside it, wrapped the spare blanket around its back, and spoke low through the wind. "You can stay out here." It didn't answer, not with movement, not with sound. So he gathered it up, blanket and all, and carried it through the snow like a child too far gone to protest. It didn't weigh much, but it felt heavier than anything he'd ever held. Back in the cabin, the heat took time to matter. He stoked the fire high, boiled water, mixed broth. He peeled off the frozen blanket and rubbed the creature's arms with warm cloth, whispering stories not meant to be understood. Railway tales, old songs, memories buried beneath layers of soot and steel. "I used to think dying meant freezing alone in a place like this," he muttered, half to himself. "Now I think it means watching something else freeze while you stand by and do nothing." The creature drank slowly. Its eyes never left his. There was no fear, no pain, just waiting. Later, when the storm howled against the walls and shadows danced across the chinking, it moved closer to the fire. Not for warmth. No, Walter felt that clearly. It moved closer to him. He was telling a story from his Kansas boyhood. How he once fell into a frozen pond chasing a sled, and how his father pulled him out, swearing louder than a preacher in a thunderstorm, when it reached out and touched his chest. A hand. Not seeking, not testing, just remembering. It stayed by the fire that night, curled not against the hearth, but beside Walter, shoulder to shoulder. Its breathing matched his. For the first time in decades, he didn't dream of trains or fire, or the sound of bones splitting under iron. He dreamed of nothing, of silence, of snow that didn't feel cold. In the following days, their rhythm changed. Walter spoke less. The creature watched more. It began mimicking small things. How he stirred the stew, how he folded his coat, how he sat with elbows on knees and stared into flames. It never spoke, but it listened, and in its own way, it answered. Once, Walter caught it tracing a knot in the floorboard with one clawed finger, drawing circles, then lines, patterns, like it was writing something in a language only trees knew. Then came the wolf. It was the third night after the storm. The fire was low. Walter nearly asleep. The creature nestled beside the coals. The wind had calmed. Until it didn't. A growl broke the silence. Deep, wet, unmistakable. Walter sat up, heart thudding. The creature was already standing, shoulders raised, eyes fixed on the door. The growl came again, closer this time. Then the sound of snow shifting. Heavy footfalls. Something pacing just outside the walls. Walter grabbed the rifle. But the creature stepped between him and the door. It growled. Not like before. Not that low, curious rumble. This was something else. Primal. Protective. Outside, the pacing stopped. Seconds passed, then minutes. And then, as if a curtain had been drawn back, the presence faded. Walter lowered the rifle. The creature turned to him, its breath short, muscles trembling. He wanted to ask what it had seen, what it knew, but it walked back to the fire, laid down and pulled the blanket over its shoulders, like nothing had happened. But something had. Hook. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't the one protecting it. It was the one protecting me. And maybe it had been from the start. After that night, Walter no longer called it it, not even in his thoughts. He didn't give it a name, but he gave it something else, a home. Through the heart of winter, they kept each other alive. He taught it how to crack ice from the well, how to pick dry kindling even in snow. It learned quickly. Intuitively, it mimicked warmth, not just survival. And sometimes, Late at night, Walter would swear he heard it, humming, just softly. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like a lullaby, or a memory from somewhere far away. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't write it down, because some truths can't be proved. They can only be lived. But the one thing he did say to me, just once, as he looked into that old, flickering flame, "There's kindness in that creature. More than I've seen in most men." He paused then. Let the silence stretch long. And that's what scares me, because nothing that good, nothing that gentle, survives in the wild by accident. The cold changed things. It made everything slower. Blood, breath, time. Days lost their names. Nights bled into each other. The wind never stopped. It just changed directions. And with each passing hour, Walter's world shrank until it was no larger than the walls of his cabin, and the silent figure curled beside the hearth. He stopped marking the days on the post near the door. It didn't matter anymore. The snow piled high against the windows, drifted past the porch, blanketed the trees so heavy they bowed toward the earth like they were praying for spring. But spring wasn't coming. Not yet. The creature, Walter still didn't have a name for it, was eating more now. Its body filled out, fur thickened. It moved with more ease, sat up straighter. It had begun mimicking his hands, how he stirred, how he cleaned his pipe, how he folded his shirt before bed. Not perfectly, but deliberately. And Walter, for all his tough skin and silence, began to talk again. Stories about rail work, about a woman he almost married in Missouri, about a dog he lost to a bear when he was just a boy. He didn't know if the creature understood, but it stayed still, listened, blinked at the right moments. Sometimes it nodded. There were nights it slept beside the fire, tucked in tight, a rhythm of breath so steady it reminded Walter of his own heartbeat. Other nights it stood by the window for hours, staring out at the woods like it was waiting for something, or someone, to return. Then came the worst of it. The sky fell for 2 days straight. Not snow, not really. Ice, sharp and relentless. It snapped branches, froze the locks, sealed the door shut with frost, thick as bone. Walter ran out of dry wood on the second night and had to burn parts of his own furniture. One chair, then a leg off the table. The creature grew restless, agitated. It paced the floor, refused food. Walter tried to calm it, speaking softly, reaching out. But it bared its teeth, not in aggression but in fear. Its body trembled with something deeper than cold. Then, sometime before dawn, it moved to the door, pressed its hand flat against the wood, and let out a sound Walter hadn't heard before. A low hum, almost a moan. But there was something inside it, grief. And then he understood. It wasn't afraid of dying. It was afraid of surviving alone. So Walter did what he hadn't done in over a decade. He sang. Not well, not loud. Just a broken, half-remembered hymn from his mother's kitchen back in Kansas. And slowly, the creature turned. Its shoulders dropped. It slid down the wall and sat beside him, watching the fire burn what little remained of the cabin's old bench. Later that morning, the wind stopped. Just like that. No warning. Walter cracked the ice from the door, forced it open. Outside, the world was white and deathly quiet. Not a bird, not a howl, not even the groan of trees. He stepped out, breath clouding before him, and looked down. Prints, small ones, half frozen. Not the creatures, not human. Something else had been circling the cabin. And the tracks didn't lead away. They led under the house. Walter crouched, heart climbing into his throat. The crawl space was dark. Still, but not empty. He saw it then. Just a shape, crouched low, watching him, breath misting from its mouth. He didn't move, didn't speak, just backed away slowly and shut the door. Inside, the creature was already standing. It had known. For how long, he didn't ask. They didn't sleep that night. They stacked wood, repacked the rifle, boiled every bit of stew they had. It wasn't panic. It was ritual. Preparation. Something old. Something primal. That was when Walter realized he wasn't just keeping this thing alive anymore. He was keeping it hidden. And whatever had found them out there in the snow, it hadn't come for food. It had come to take something back. Look, I thought I was the only one who had found it, but I was wrong. Something else had been following it too, and I had just invited it into my life. They kept the fire burning through the next 3 days. Neither of them spoke much, but they watched each other closely. Every movement mattered now. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan in the woods. Walter began sleeping with one hand on the rifle and one eye on the window. The creature never went outside alone again. It didn't hum anymore. And one night, long after the last of the ice had melted from the eaves, Walter found a mark etched into the snow just outside the door. Not a footprint, a symbol. 3 long claw lines curved into a spiral. He didn't tell the creature. He just swept it away before morning. Because, whatever it meant, it was meant for him. And the thing that made it wasn't gone. Not yet. The last frost came with silence. No wind. No birdsong. Just a thick stillness hanging over the trees like breath held too long. Walter had stepped out that morning to find the snow crusted, not fresh. The sun hung low, pale and cold, but it stayed longer in the sky now. That was how he knew the season was turning. The creature had grown. Not just stronger, taller. Its limbs had stretched out. Its steps no longer shuffled but strode with purpose. It no longer slept beside the fire but moved between corners of the cabin, sat on the stool when Walter read aloud, pointed at objects with quiet insistence. It was becoming something. Or maybe becoming itself again. And then it began to wake before him, not by minutes, but by hours. He'd stir at dawn to find it standing at the window, still as stone, eyes fixed beyond the trees. Sometimes it would hum. But the melody was different now. Not soft, not mournful, hopeful. Walter didn't ask. He didn't need to. Something had changed. It was on the 3rd day of melt when it happened. The creek cracked open like a rib cage and water began to flow again in slow pulses beneath the ice. Walter had taken the creature with him that morning. Its first full walk past the clearing in weeks. It moved carefully, nose high, sniffing the air like it was reading messages left behind on the wind. They were halfway to the ridge when Walter felt it, that old pull on the back of the neck. Not wind, not sound, just instinct. He turned. At the tree line stood a figure, taller than him by a full head, covered in dense, dark fur, arms long, longer than a man's, shoulders like a bull elk, and the face, barely visible through the shadow, but not unfamiliar. It was watching them. Walter didn't breathe. He didn't move. Neither did the creature beside him. Then it did. It stepped forward. Just one step. And the smaller one, the one Walter had fed, housed, sheltered, stepped forward too. Toward it. No sound, no fear. Just motion like memory. The tall one waited. Walter wanted it to call out, to stop it, but he didn't. Because something told him this was never going to be his to keep. They met at the edge of the pines. The smaller one reached up. The tall one bent low. They touched heads. No words, just contact. Gentle, absolute. Then the tall one turned its gaze to Walter. And that was the moment he never forgot. Because it didn't look at him like prey, or like a threat. It looked at him like a father sizing up a stranger who's been raising his child. And somehow, Walter understood he'd passed. The tall one turned, stepped back into the trees. The smaller one looked at Walter. Hook, and I swear to you, what I saw in its eyes then, it wasn't gratitude. It was love, the kind that hurts when it leaves. It turned and followed. No wave, no sound. Just gone. Walter stood there for what felt like hours. Maybe it was minutes. He didn't remember the walk back. He didn't speak that night, didn't light the fire, didn't eat. The cabin didn't feel empty. It felt finished. But the next morning, there were tracks again. Near the creek, not small, not alone. 2 sets, one lighter, one heavy. They led away from the clearing, back into the higher woods. And Walter understood. They hadn't left him. They'd just gone home. He spent that spring in silence, not because he mourned, but because the woods no longer felt like they were waiting to speak. They had said what they needed, and they had listened in return. Still, he left food out sometimes, just in case. And once, just once, he found the blanket he'd given, returned to the stump, folded neatly, a small bundle of pine cones tied inside. He never told a soul, not until me, because that kind of goodbye, it belongs to the trees. The days after were too quiet, not peaceful, vacant. Like something sacred had been removed from the land, and all that was left was the sound of wind filling in its place. Walter found himself listening for a presence that no longer made sound. Every creak of a tree branch, every flap of wings overhead, felt like a memory trying to replay itself, but missing the voice at the center. The cabin felt larger now. Not physically, but in that way. An old house feels after someone's moved out. Walter still cooked 2 portions without thinking. Still left the stew simmering too long, expecting someone to sniff at the pot. He caught himself talking aloud more, narrating his chores, not because he needed to speak, but because he'd gotten used to being heard. The stump out back, where he used to leave food, had grown moss over one edge. He cleaned it with the side of his hand, not out of habit, out of hope. A week after the creature's departure, he followed a hunch. Something pulled him back to the creek. Snowmelt trickled through the rocks, soft and shallow, barely enough to wet the sole of a boot. But there they were again. Prints, not the ones from before. These were bigger, much bigger. The kind that shouldn't have come back. They weren't walking toward the woods. They were circling. Walter crouched. He traced the edge of one with a stick, heart tapping in his throat. The print was fresh, damp earth packed and sunken. And next to it, fainter, lighter, barely visible, was a second, smaller, familiar. They'd returned. But not to him. He stayed at the creek for hours that day, pretending to fish, but listening for movement. The woods didn't speak. Not in words, not even in warnings. That night, as he sat by the fire with his hands around a tin cup, he felt it. Not a breeze, not a draft. A presence. Not inside the cabin. Just outside. He stood, quiet. Moved to the window and looked through the warped glass. And there, under the moonlight, barely more than a silhouette, stood the tall one. Same massive shoulders. Same massive shoulders. Same stance. Unmoving. Beside it, another form. Lower. Lighter. But not the same. Smaller. Younger. Hook. I thought I had taken in a lost soul. But what if I'd interrupted something else entirely, like a rite or a trial? What if that winter wasn't a rescue, but an accident? The 2 figures stood in silence, watching, waiting. Walter opened the door, but by the time he stepped out, they were gone. No sound, no footprints, just air still trembling with the weight of something not quite finished. For weeks after, Walter saw signs. Bent twigs in the same direction. Small nests of fur tucked into corners of the woodpile. Food left on the porch. Fish bones, pine needles, once even a feather tied with twine. Tokens or messages. He never saw them again. Not fully, but he felt them. And every so often, at dusk, he'd hear a single whistle from deep within the forest. High, steady, with a trailing note at the end that sounded almost like his own name. He never told the townfolk. Never wrote it down, because what lived in that forest didn't want to be known. It wanted to be remembered, and remembered it was. Even now, decades later, I go back sometimes. I find the trailhead behind the old rock with the notch in it. I follow the way he showed me before his hands got too tired to draw maps. I sit at the edge of the creek and listen, not for footsteps, but for breathing. Because the forest doesn't forget kindness. It just waits until it needs it again. I sometimes wonder if he'd planned to tell me, or if the story just finally needed to be let out before it died with him. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a tale meant to convince. It was memory, raw and untamed, laid out before me like a map he'd drawn in his sleep for 50 years. Walter's hands were trembling when he spoke, more from age than fear, but his eyes stayed locked on the fire, like they were watching it replay scenes only he could see. He didn't raise his voice, didn't dramatize a word. He simply told me what happened that winter. The winter when something impossible walked into his life and sat beside his fire as if it had always belonged there. When he finished, I sat there for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at me. Tired, sure, but more alive than I'd seen him in years. Would you have helped it? That question's haunted me ever since. Not because of what it implies, but because of what it reveals. The answer says more about who you are than about what you believe. Because this wasn't about believing in Bigfoot. It wasn't about monsters or wilderness legends. It was about what you do when something lost and scared and foreign shows up at your doorstep. And it's not easy. It's not easy to give warmth to a shadow, to speak kindness into a silence that doesn't echo back, to share what little you have with something you don't understand. But Walter did. Not because he was noble, but because he was lonely. Because he'd been broken once, left out in the cold, and someone had once helped him get back up. Maybe that's all it takes to do something impossible. Remembering that you were saved once too. I think about that winter often. I imagine the fireside, the soft thud of footfalls outside, the weight of breath in the room. And I think about that creature, what it saw in Walter, what it remembered of him after. And then I think about the world we live in now, louder, quicker to shut doors. And I wonder, would any of us open them? Hook. Or would we do what we've learned too well? Call it crazy, lock the door, and pray the knocking stops. You know, the woods haven't changed. They still hold secrets in the same damp roots and swaying shadows. Still carry voices that only speak when you stop trying to listen. I've walked those trails. I've left bread on the stump. I've waded through the silence, the wind, the dusk. I've even seen shapes that don't belong to deer, but they don't come close anymore. Maybe they know it was never about Walter's cabin. Maybe it was about the man himself, or maybe they're just waiting for someone else to listen. I leave the door unlocked sometimes, not because I expect company, but because it feels right. Because maybe one day, something lost will find its way to my fire. And when it does, I hope I remember what he taught me. Not to run, not to fear, but to sit quiet, to offer what little I have, and to ask gently, "Are you cold?" Then wait, because sometimes that's all they need, just one night of not being hunted. One night of not being alone. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. In the end, the forest keeps its secrets. It always has. And maybe it always should. Not everything that breathes among the trees was made to be captured in photographs or bound by names. Some things are meant to exist just outside the reach of logic, where the ground softens beneath your boots, where the air still smells of pine and stories unspoken, and where time moves like mist curling through the underbrush. There's a strange comfort in knowing we don't have all the answers, We spend our lives chasing facts, digging for proof, demanding clarity. And yet, the things that stay with us the longest are rarely the ones we can explain. They're the feelings we get when the hair stands up on the back of our neck, when a shadow moves just a little too smoothly through the dark, when something beyond the firelight seems to wait, not with menace, but with memory. Maybe that's the purpose of stories like this. Not to convince, not to frighten, but to remind. To remind us that not everything unknown is dangerous. That not every silence needs to be filled. That not every visitor is an intruder. Sometimes, what we fear is just what we don't recognize yet. And sometimes, what we call monstrous is only waiting for a little kindness to reveal something ancient and achingly familiar. The wilderness is full of echoes. It holds on to moments we've long forgotten and hums with the traces of things that pass through without leaving a name. And maybe we've become too proud, too loud, too quick to dismiss the whispers that linger between the wind and the leaves. Maybe we've forgotten that wonder isn't childish, and mystery isn't a flaw in the world, but a gift. It's easy to laugh off legends, easier still to scoff at people who've seen things you haven't. But before we write off the impossible, maybe we should ask ourselves, when was the last time we really listened? Not just with our ears, but with the part of us that remembers what it felt like to be small, alone, lost. Because if you've ever been in need, really in need, you know what a small kindness can mean. A warm place, a soft voice, a hand that doesn't pull back. Perhaps what waits out there isn't trying to scare us. Perhaps it's trying to see if we've still got room for the unknown. In a world where everything is tracked, tagged, mapped, and scanned, there's still value in leaving space for wonder, for questions without answers, for stories told in whispers around the fire. Not because they're true in the way we define truth, but because they touch something real inside us. So the next time you hear a sound in the woods that doesn't quite belong, or catch a glimpse of movement where there should be none, don't rush to explain it away. Sit with it. Let it linger. Let it remind you that we are not alone in this world, not in the way we think. And that maybe, just maybe, that's a beautiful thing. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the unknown. If this story stirred something in you, wonder, fear, compassion, or simply curiosity, share it with us in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts, your stories, your truths. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to this channel. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Real, strange, human stories that blur the line between what is and what might be. Until then, keep the fire warm and never stop listening.